Okay, we are live. Hello, everyone. This is the second episode of the Traditionalism series. Today we have a special guest, Andrew Bartel. How are you doing, Andrew?
I'm doing great, Ezekiel. How are you?
Excellent, excellent, my friend. I'm doing great as well. I'm doing great as well. So, tell us a little about you. Who is Andrew? And tell us maybe why are you. This is a question I like to ask to the ones who come to the channel. Why are you Catholic? And what were the strongest moments of conversion in your lifetime?
Sure. So I live in Montana and I live in a log cabin with my beautiful wife and our three lovely children. I have a son and two daughters. And for a living, I do glass work. So the technical name for that is glazier. So I install windows, shower enclosures, mirrors, railing jobs, interior glass walls for like office spaces, things like that. So that's how I put bread on the table and keep a roof over our heads. And I'm also a lay Dominican. So there's several things that go with that. Of course, the our chapter meetings, ongoing formation, and then as well as our my various ministerial uh, jobs that I have in the church, especially involved around teaching, and of course talking with Dom and the Logos Project, and you are a big part of that. So living the Dominican spirituality, of course, is central to my life, and then I also am going to school part time as well. I've been working toward a couple years ago. I picked up my undergraduate degree again, so I'm working toward a degree in English and philosophy. So between all of those things, that keeps me pretty busy. But
Awesome.
as far as my faith life, of course, Jesus Christ and the gospel that He came to share with the world, and the life of holiness that He came to incorporate us into so that we could share in the life of the Trinity again. That is central to my life. That is everything to me. I was thankfully, thanks be to God, I was raised in a very devoted Christian family. From the age of 1 to 5, my parents were very fervent evangelical Protestants. They belonged to the Assemblies of God, which is a Pentecostal denomination. And I was dedicated to the Lord, as they don't really have baptism, at least not until you get older, from the time I was a child. And then my parents, through their study of the faith, eventually came to the conclusion that there were several issues that they were struggling with. They had a lot of questions that weren't being answered. And one day, a Catholic friend introduced my mother to Rome Sweet Home by Scott Hahn, and that really was the final um, pushing of my mother and father into the Catholic Church. And so I was baptized in Okinawa, Japan, because my parents were in the military, and my father was stationed there in the Marine Corps. So I was baptized there at the air base, and after that, we came back to the States probably about 6 months later. My father decided he wanted to leave the military, and so he was honorably discharged, and we moved to Montana. And it was during this time that my parents were going through RCAA because, of course, they were adults. So we were all got to be baptized back in Japan because we were children, but my parents were still going through RCAA. And it was in the process of going through RCAA that they began to be scandalized by some of the things that they were encountering. Nuns teaching really strange, wacky teachings, strange liturgies with weird music, and they were wondering, what is this, the Catholic Church we converted into? So they started talking to people, they started getting some magazines, doing some research, and that eventually landed them into the traditional Catholic movement. They started out with indult parishes and the FSSP at first, but eventually because my parents always want to be at the front lines of the battle. They felt that that front line would be the Society of St. Pius X. And they started interacting with they started visiting SSPX chapels and reading the writings, especially of Archbishop Marcel Lefebvre and of Bishop Richard Williamson, because he had a regular letter that he would release each weekly. And he also wrote letters from the seminary, because he was in charge of seminaries. And they read a lot of that. And they were told by an FSSP priest that they could go to SSPX masses as long as they didn't talk to anyone. They shouldn't talk to anyone. They could go to the masses. But of course, that didn't last very long. I mean, how do you go to mass and not talk to people? So eventually, which was kind of a gradual movement more and more into the SSPX circles. So from the time I was about 7 years old, I was raised in the traditional Catholic movement within the SSPX. It wasn't very long after that, though, that my mother encountered former SSPX priests and their writings who had left the SSPX and become sedevacantists. And she believed that their views on the sacraments and on the structures of the church and things such as that were more consistent with what she was reading in Catholic tradition. And so she aligned herself more with their views, although she continued to go to the SSPX chapel that we all went to as a family. So I was raised in this movement, and I had good and dedicated priests who passed on the faith to me. And my parents, of course, were very fervent in their faith. So I was very well catechized. And so because the faith was everything to my parents, it became everything to me. So any parents who may be watching this, if you make your practice of the faith the center of your lives and not just something you do on Sunday, it's something that you incorporate into your daily life with daily prayers, such as the Liturgy of the Hours or the Rosary. Or my mother was always so good about celebrating liturgical feasts and making a big deal about it, the feast of the church. If you do that, your children will keep the faith. Oh, I mean, of course, there is still, some of them may stray for a while. But if you make the faith the center of your life, 9 times out of 10, your children are going to keep the faith. It's when you relegate the practices of the faith to Sunday that often you end up with, well, it's just kind of the societal club, and real life happens the rest of the week. So that was what gave me my love of Christ, and eventually me falling head over heels in love with the church. So that's kind of a brief summary of where my fervor for the faith came from, and why that is really at the center of my life.
Excellent, Andrew. Excellent. Just to introduce the audience, I got to know Andrew in January this year after reading an article he uploaded in
the Catholic World Report.
Yeah, there he tells his story about why he left the SSPX. And to keep on this introduction, this is the second video of this traditionalism series. Hopefully, in the upcoming weeks, we'll have John Salsa and Michael Lofton here talking with us. Today, we are talking about the dangers of the SSPX. Moreover, today we'll cover some errors of the SSPX as well, and of Archbishop Lefebvre. But that will be the central theme of John Salsa and Michael Lofton, the errors of the SSPX and Archbishop Lefebvre. So, first question I wanted to ask you, Andrew, before we dig in. Many people tell me, Ezekiel, you shouldn't be doing these videos. We are all on the same team, tradition. We have to combat modernism. Don't divide. You are dividing the traditionalists. Don't do this. So why is it important to talk about these issues of traditionalism? Why is it important to talk about the SSPX?
Yes, I would say that the number one reason is because we are not united. There's only one way that we're truly united, and that is in our hatred toward what we call the conciliar church, or the false church, or the modernists. So we are united in rejecting the Second Vatican Council and united in the rejection of the reforms that followed, especially the Novus Ordo Mass. But otherwise, we're all over the map. You have SSPX, Society of St. Pius X. You have Society of St. Pius V, which broke off from the Society of St. Pius X. You have the Congregation of Mary Immaculate Queen, which was started by, I'm trying to remember his, Schuckart, I believe, and a whole bunch of independent priests. And you have all these different independent priests as well who are running around saying different things. And each of these groups has a different narrative. Each of these groups disagrees on very, very important aspects of sacramental theology, of the teaching on the papacy, on the church, and all kinds, and even on how to live the spiritual life in the modern world. So there are major fundamental differences between these groups, and that's why they condemn each other so ferociously. And even, for example, between a traditional group such as the Fraternity of St. Peter and the SSPX, there is also a mutual hostility or animosity between these two as well. They are not on the same page, especially when it comes to the papacy and the church. So any kind of unity there might be, it's a false unity. It's not a true unity. It's the same kind of unity that Protestants might try to claim and say, oh, we're all just Christian. As long as you believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God and that he came to save us and died for our sins, then you're a Christian and everything else is great. And that doesn't work like that. There's major disagreements on areas such as baptism, whether it should be as an infant or as an adult. How many sacraments are there? What does it mean to belong to the church? What books in the Bible are there? These are major issues. So you can't, it's a false kind of unity.
Yeah, there. Don't, I don't know if it is Dom or Sam, but he's telling ironically false ecumenism.
Yes,
they
exactly.
the SSPX, for the audience who may not know, the SSPX critiques a lot the post-conciliar doctrines, conciliar doctrines of ecumenism. Saying it is a false ecumenism, and well, this is ironically what Andrew is describing about what happens in the traditionalist movement. So another thing, that's excellent. They are not united. We are divided. The ones who pertain to that groups. Another question, one friend of mine told me the other day was, I explained my friend what were synthetically. I explained her which were the main errors in ecclesiology of the SSPX, and she told me, first of all, it is a falsehood that the SSPX is not part of the church. That's one thing to address. But in the other hand, she tells me, you can say whatever you want, but the fruits of the SSPX are amazing. They're amazing. So that's why I wanted to bring you here today, Andrew, because I know that assertion does not apply to your life in the SSPX. So I just want to first to stay clear. The SSPX is not part of the Roman Catholic Church, juridically speaking. Canonically speaking, legally speaking. The church is a juridical structure, and the SSPX has no canonical status and has not been sent canonically by the church, which is a question of divine mission. We'll covering that with John Salsa in the upcoming weeks. But that's to stay clear the question. It's a falsehood to say that the SSPX is part of the Catholic Church, at least canonically speaking. So the other thing, this is a thing that many tell me. The fruits of Archbishop Lefebvre. He was a holy man. So good fruits. The SSPX, so many vocations. So here I wanted to bring the the issues you wrote about in your article. Maybe tell us how did specifically the SSPX influence your childhood, your age as a teenager, your family. Also, maybe explain a little bit what vacantism is. And let's talk about that.
Sure. Yes, definitely. I would say the fruits argument is one of the main ones that are brought up, especially by, your typical layperson. They're going to say, "But I'm experiencing these good things. I've had these awful experiences in the church. I've had poor pastoral care by this pastor. I've encountered this terrible liturgy. I've had, and there's, look at all this terrible infiltration, especially if they get caught up in that infiltration narrative. They'll say the church is full of gays and perverts and Freemasons. And so I can't be fed by these people. So but I'm experiencing these amazing fruits in the SSPX, people who want the faith, who are having reverent liturgies. Everything looks clean and good. I'm having great interactions with these people. Therefore, it should be evident that the church, the Novus Ordo Church, is bad, and the SSPX and the Remnant Church is good. But that argument, of course, is very limited, especially in terms of quantity, because it's based on your experience, and a person's experience is necessarily limited. You can't take in the entire Catholic Church based off of one experience, or even based off of a nationality. That unfortunately, that just doesn't hold water. And with regards to the fruits argument, unfortunately, it's just very subjective, because if you were to apply that same reasoning to any other denomination, such as Baptists or Anglicans or Pentecostals or many other Christian, or even the Mormon Church, you will find many elements of truth and grace and goodness in those movements, and you can point to them. But because you have good fruits does not necessarily justify that everything else is right. Everything else is going correctly. And the same argument was actually brought up in my debate with Jeff Kassman. He brought up, well, look at all these fruits that are happening. And because there's fruits, therefore everything is okay. Or because we've had positive interactions with Rome and we work with them in these areas, therefore everything's okay. And I pointed out that it doesn't work like that. Just because you have good things that you might do, or you're having positive interactions, doesn't mean that you aren't also having negative interactions or bad things that are also happening. And you need to take those into account as well. So in the case of a husband who abuses his wife on a regular basis, just because he does acts of kindness, and you can say, well, look at the acts of kindness, or look at when he's interacting positively with his wife. That does not mean that there isn't a chronic situation of him abusing his wife on a regular basis. So that's why it falls flat. You have to, the fruits argument is only one among many criteria that help us to discern where the true Church of Christ is. You can't rely on any one rule of faith or any one criteria. You have to take them all together. So, and that's where people start getting into issues. You take only the Bible, or you take only tradition and the Bible, or you take only the fruits argument, or you take only miracles. All of these things, you can find these things in other groups, but that doesn't mean that they have all of the rules of faith and that they have everything as the church is supposed to look like, as divinely instituted and constituted by Christ. So, and I can tell you just from my personal experience that I have had good fruits from the SSPX when people have faithfully passed on the faith of Christ, when we have worshiped reverently, things when we've adopted certain cultural practices that are beneficial to family life, things like that. I experienced very good fruits in my life, and I saw those good fruits in my family's life as well. But with regards to the traditional Catholic movement, you have to look at what kind of fruits are coming from their positions. So from their traditional position of being at odds with Rome, what kind of fruits are coming out of this? Because my family and I, we completely bought into everything. We bought into the leadership and saintliness of Archbishop Marcel Lefebvre. We adhered to the leadership of the Superior General of the Society of St. Pius X. Well, my father and myself more than my mother. My mother distrusted them more because she was sedevacantist, but otherwise we saw them as being better leadership than anything you could find anywhere else. So the four bishops, and especially for my family, Bishop Williamson was a big one. Also our local pastor, or we called them pastors. And that's the other thing, boots on the ground. You call these SSPX priests your pastors, and you act just like it's a parallel church, even though they say, well, we try to discourage people from not saying parish or pastor or anything like that. We're living like a parallel church. Practically speaking, it is in fact a parallel church. And these absurd nuances that are on paper, that's not how we actually live as traditional Catholics in this extreme element of the traditionalist movement. So as my parents and I jumped whole hog into reading all of the writings, we got the Angelus magazine every month. We were doing all the devotional practices, praying the rosary, going to mass on a regular basis, all of these different things. You would think that the fruits would be good from living this life of traditional Catholicism, but they were not. As a matter of fact, diving more and more into the movement led my family down a destructive path, and it led us splitting three ways, with my mother first moving toward the sedevacantism. So for those who aren't familiar with sedevacantism, it comes from the two Latin words, sede vacante, which means empty seat. And these are people who believe there has been no pope since Pope St. Pius XII died in 1958. They believe all of these popes have abdicated their office through heresy. And my mother found that very convincing. I mean, after all, if we believe that these popes are promulgating Protestant masses and promulgating councils with heresies in them, how could we hold that be a true pope? It doesn't make any sense. How could a true pope who's supposed to be the rock of Christ destroy the church? The whole recognize and resist argument didn't make sense to her, especially as she read quote after quote from popes like Pope Pius X, Pope Leo XIII, all so many documents, unum sanctum, that said submission to the Pope is necessary for salvation. You have to submit to the Pope in areas of faith and morals. That is the traditional Catholic teaching. This constant recognize and resist, they realize, as many sedevacantist authors point out, such as Father Cicada and Bishop Dolan and others, when it comes to recognizing and resisting, that applies to moral theology or the moral life. So if somebody tells you to sin, then you shouldn't sin. But with regards to the teaching of the faith and the passing on of the faith, we are called to submit our will and intellect to the authority of the church. And that is solid traditional Catholic teaching. One example I often give to people is that if you have a malformed conscience, such as you're struggling with laxity, and you think that something is not a sin that is a sin, or if you're a scrupulous person and you think that something that is not a sin is a sin, you have to completely submit your mind and will to your confessor in order to correct that problem. That's classic moral theology, classic teaching 101. And even though your conscience is telling you this is a sin or this is not a sin, you have to go in, with the advice, with the commands of your confessor, if you're ever going to free yourself from that spiritual disease. And the magisterium and the Pope and the bishops, all in union with them, the bishop and the local bishops exercising their magisterium in union with the Pope, are this safeguard to our sensus fidei. So we have to have an attitude of respect for the authority of the church, and especially and give precedence and preference to the authority of the church rather than to our own conscience, because we could have a malformed conscience, and that's the whole role of the authority of the church. But unfortunately, in the traditional Catholic movement, the waters have been muddied, And all the emphasis is on resistance, resistance, resistance. And that's a serious problem, especially for a Catholic, to have a constant attitude of resistance to the hierarchy that's now been going on for over half a century. Where do we see this in Catholic history except in the schismatic and heretical movements? So that's what happened with my eventually my mother and father began to drifting further and further apart in their positions. And then in 2012, when the society split in two, it's the biggest split in the Society of St. Pius X's history. One of the bishops, Bishop Williamson, was expelled, and multiple good priests, known as hardliner priests, because they adhered more to the positions of Archbishop Lefebvre, they should have nothing to do with the conciliar church, keep them at arm's length until they come back to tradition. And they were reacting against the softliners, such as Bishop Fillet and Father Schmidberger, who said, no, we have to interact with Rome as much as possible. All of that came to a head, and it was an eruption. And all of a sudden, you have two SSPXs, both of them using the Archbishop as an example and to support their position. And both were able to do so. Both were able to find quotes from Archbishop Marcel Lefebvre saying, draw close to Rome. And both were able to, and the others were able to find quotes from Archbishop Lefebvre saying, stay away from the conciliar church. We'll have nothing to do with these modernist antichrists. So it was natural that all this stuff was going to come to a head. And so now my family had to decide, okay, well, which SSPX are we going to go with? And my mom moved more toward the direction. She said, chickens have come home to roost for the SSPX. So I'm digging in with Sedevacantism. Dad followed the leadership of Bishop Williamson and the SSPX resistance. And I was like, I don't know where I'm going. I just dove into the study of Sedevacantism and dove into the recognize and resist position. I dove into all of it. And the more I studied Sedevacantism and the more I studied the recognize resist positions, I realized they each have a chunk of the pie. Both of them are saying things that are in accord with the tradition of the church. So on the recognize and resist side, they're saying we have to have a visible structure. We have to have a pope. You can't just have that disappear overnight. And the Sedevacantists are saying, yes, you have to have a pope, but it's better to recognize that maybe we'll get a pope someday in one of these other ways, rather than acting like schismatics toward the pope and thinking that you can completely disregard things that traditionally as Catholics, you cannot disregard. It doesn't, all you have to do is study Sedevacantism in depth to realize it's rooted in the tradition. Not everything, of course. I'm not saying this is a blanket approval of Sedevacantism. They're missing huge pieces of the pie as well. But what I'm saying is that I realized that if I wanted to have the fullness of the pie, I needed to look elsewhere. It couldn't be found in the traditional Catholic movement. It could not be found. And thankfully, there were these few moments that I was having in my journey that started moving me closer to what I thought was an awful monster of the modernist conciliar church. And one of the first of those was when I was studying Michael Davies. He was talking about the indefectibility of the church and that this is a protection. It's one of the three attributes of the church. It's a protection from the church giving something that will harm her faithful. And so he was arguing that the Novus Ordo Missae, as it was officially promulgated, cannot be harmful to your faith. And that was something that goes completely against what Archbishop Lefebvre argued in his many times. You can find it in his letter to confused Catholics and in many of his sermons and speeches that he gave. And it's also currently still the official position of the SSPX. And Michael Davies, who wrote 3 volumes defending Archbishop Lefebvre, and who also wrote 3 more volumes cracking down and saying everything that could be possibly wrong about the Novus Ordo, was saying that as it was officially promulgated to the church, that it was free of faith and morals. And I said, there is an inherent contradiction going on here. There is something wrong that I need to get to the bottom of. And of course, it coincided with a lot of the same things I was reading. The Sedevacantists say the exact same things that Michael Davies was saying, but Michael Davies was saying it, he was speaking out of one side of his mouth here and then contradicting himself over here. So there was this kind of intellectual incoherence that I said, this can't be reconciled. And then also, I was listening to a talk by Jerry Matitix, who is a Home Alone sedevacantist. He started by coming into the church before his friend Scott Hahn. You can see him mentioned in Rome Sweet Home. And then he followed the same trajectory as my parents, first ending up in the traditional movement in the church, such as FSSP and indult masses, then going from there to the SSPX, then going from the SSPX to CMRI and SSPV and sedevacantist groups, and then going from there to being in his home alone, not having any sacraments, through his own study of tradition. And he's a brilliant, brilliant man. And when you listen to his talks, you realize he's drawing solidly from the tradition of the church. And so he argued himself right alone with no sacramental life, not knowing where the Church of Christ is, just waiting for, begging Christ to come home, to come back to earth and sort out the mess because he doesn't know what to do. And so it was through that he introduced me to the work of St. Francis de Sales and the Catholic controversy. And that was the final nail in the coffin for me for the extreme traditionalist Catholic movement. I realized none of these clergy, the reason they're falling into error, the reason there's all these incoherences and contradictions, and especially when they're arguing amongst themselves, the reason why there's all these contradictions is because none of them has the mission to teach. None of them has the mission to pass on the faith authentically without error. They separated themselves from the juridical and structure of the church, from the Rock of Peter, and from all of the bishops. And in doing so, they've begun to fall into inconsistency after heresy after heresy. And so I realized the only place that you can find what St. Francis de Sales and the other doctors of the church, and bring those two pieces of the pie those many pieces of the pie that I was encountering in the different traditionalist groups, the only way you can find them all together in their fullness is within the Catholic Church. So now I had to step back and say, okay, maybe a lot of the things that I originally thought about the Catholic Church are wrong. I'm probably prejudiced. I was probably raised like an anti-Catholic. And the more I started reading the positive things that were happening in the church, the good fruits that were coming out of the church, the more I saw reverent celebrations of the Novus Ordo Mass, the more I saw the miracles coming from the intercession of the saints, Eucharistic miracles, and what is supposedly something that's an abomination to God. There are Eucharistic miracles happening there.
Andrew, what people, I usually say that to trust friends, if the Novus Ordo Mass is so bad, why are there so many miracles? And you know what they tell me? They tell me it must be because there is a lack of faith in the Eucharistic, in the real presence. So Christ is showing up to tell them you have to have faith. It's nothing to do with the Novus Ordo Mass and with the church. It's only to advise people that Christ is there. So they will bring these arguments.
Sure. Yeah, and you could totally bring that up, but I mean, you could also, bring that up with every other Eucharistic miracle that's ever been in the history of the Catholic Church. I mean, the reason why Christ gives us these miracles is to affirm his presence. And so by doing that in these Novus Ordo Masses, he is affirming his presence within them. And, people will say, well, he's affirming his presence because they're abusing him. They're abusing him in the Mass, right? Okay, so I mean, how is that supposed to be an argument? I mean, if that's the case, then you would think that there would Christ would just say, this is an abomination. This is something that's not happening, that shouldn't be happening, and I'm not going to have anything to do with this church, and I'm going to build the faith with the true remnant church, right? So you have to take everything in context. You have to take the Eucharistic miracles in the context of the fact that this is a good Mass that was validly promulgated by the church. You have to take it with the fact that the Masses that are being presided over here are in union with the bishop, and that the fathers of the church have said, don't ever worship in a Mass that's outside of communion with the bishop. So these miracles that happen are meant to be a confirmation of the life of church and the life of grace and of Christ working within his church to build up the church from within. So you have to take everything together as a whole and not just say, I mean, if you just use the Eucharistic miracles argument isolated from everything else, then yeah, that's why they can come up with these objections that weaken the argument. But you have to look at everything. You have to look at the whole tapestry. Because if you're only looking at one thing in isolation, then you can, I mean, it's like dissecting something. If you dissect a certain part of a frog, are you going to know that, unless somebody tells you, are you going to know that part that's been dissected is part of that frog? Probably not. So when you only take something in isolation or compartmentalize from the rest of things and you scrutinize it so much, it's like getting too close to a tapestry. You just look at a thread, you can't see the whole picture. You have to step back, look at all the threads working together in unison, or all of the parts of the frog that in a live frog working together in unison to be able to see the full picture. And that's my appeal to anyone in the traditional Catholic movement. Don't just fixate on any one reason, such as the fruits argument or the miracles argument or the rule of faith as tradition argument. You need to look at everything because because Catholicism is not just one obsession about one thing. It's the beautiful combination of many things that come together to make the beautiful complex organism that is the body of Christ.
Totally. Can you explain a little bit further what that St. Francis de Sales mission is?
Sure. So it's the first part of the book, The Catholic Controversy, written by St. Francis de Sales. And in it, he is attempting to refute the reformers, the Calvinist reformers especially. And before he starts getting into any of the issues surrounding scripture and a lot of the things that the Protestant reformers were bringing up, he begins his book with mission. And he's writing to Catholics who have left the church to follow after these new ministers. And he challenges them and says, why did you think that you could leave the officially appointed ministers of the church for these ministers who have no mission? And he shows from scripture and tradition that you have to have a mission from God or from someone who God has appointed in order to be able to teach others. If you don't, you shouldn't even be listening to them. And so he admonishes these ex-Catholics and says, you guys need to come back into the fold of the church and come back where true ministers can be found, because these ministers have no mission. Because there's only two types of mission. There's either immediate mission or immediate mission. Immediate mission is the mission given directly by God to somebody that he appoints. So in the Old Testament, you would have someone like Moses who interacts with God one-on-one, and then he teaches the people, and then God gives his law to Moses through those people. And then you also have Christ, who had his immediate mission from the Father. You have the apostles who had their immediate mission from Christ himself. And the number one criteria for whether or not you have this mission is the working of extraordinary miracles, like ground shaking type of miracles, and constant, the raising of the dead to life, the healing of serious illnesses or diseases, the stopping of nature's natural laws, right? Really remarkable miracles that go along and show that God is with this person because he's actually stopping the ordinary laws of nature to draw our attention to this person. And then you have immediate mission, which is a mission or a delegation of authority to those from someone who has immediate mission. So that would be the appointment of Joshua by Moses in the Old Testament, or it would be the appointment of the successors of the apostles. and the apostles also with their sending out their priests into their own areas to minister to the people of God and to bring others into the fold of Christ. So in order to be somebody who can actually be listened to and who has the authority to pass on the gospel and to preach the gospel, you have to have this mission. And this is rooted in you can find it over and over and over again in the scriptures, in the tradition of the church. Just as St. Paul said, how can someone preach unless he be sent? So you cannot preach unless you have this mission. So as you can see, none of the traditionalist clergy who are operating separate from Rome can either claim immediate mission or mediate mission. And that means that they are not true ministers of the Church of Christ.
Yeah, I saw that argument in John Salsa's article. Does the SSPX have extraordinary mission? Well, I think there were like 5 guys who attempted to refute it. None of them could, because as John says, it is of divine law. So it is an argument that cannot be refuted.
It's irrefutable. Yes.
Unless the SSPX comes tomorrow with some miracle, but that hasn't happened. Indeed, that has happened in the conciliar modernist church.
Yes, miracles still happen. Actually, here's one really good example. So Pope Saint John the 23rd, right? He was the first spearhead pope who launched the church in this new direction. He called the Second Vatican Council. And there's a remarkable miracle that you can find where a nun, she had to have surgery on her stomach. She was having stomach problems, and they had to shrink it to the size of a walnut. And her chances of being able to survive that and being able to not, die in the subsequent future because of malnutrition, not being able to take in what she needed, were very, very high. The doctors did not give her much hope. And she prayed to the intercession of John the 23rd, and he came to her at night and laid his hand on her stomach. And the next morning, she was able to eat just as much as all of the other sisters, and she went on to live a normal, healthy life as a person. It completely flabbergasted and blew the doctors away. So, and this, you can find multiple examples such as this from the popes who implemented the reforms, who called the Second Vatican Council, implemented the reforms, promulgated the Novus Ordo Mass, as well as other Catholics who fully embraced the Novus Ordo Mass and the Second Vatican Council, such as Venerable Fulton Sheen and others. So you can see that the miracles are still present within the church, confirming the mission of Christ's bishops to still teach.
Awesome, Andrew. Something that gets to my mind as another danger of the SSPX and independent clergy and sedevacantists. I heard John Salsa once say that spiritual masters teach that if one does not respect the lawful authority, or that if one rejects the authority of the church or your authority, that makes you enter in a state of very dangerous, susceptible to demonic attack. I don't know if you heard that.
Yes, absolutely. Because when you sin, and especially in a very public sin that separates you from the life of the church, there are demons attached to sin. So you are going to start experiencing certain bitter fruits that will flow, just as you experience positive fruits that flow from the life of virtue. The bitter fruits that flow from the life of sin and the demons and the influence of the demons that are attached to that will also begin to wreak havoc in your life. even if subjectively you're not culpable. That's what many people fail to realize, is that just because you might not necessarily be subjectively culpable of that mortal sin, it does not mean that the effects of that sin are not still going to wreak havoc on your life. And that's why we have to reach out to people and inform them of their precarious situation and point to these negative aspects that are affecting their life. I mean, one of the first things I look at too is that if the traditional movement, this extreme traditional movement operating outside of the church, either in the Sedevacantists or in the Society of St. Pius X, if this was the true remnant and we were supposed to belong to this true church, this true eternal church, you might say, or the true spiritual church, if we were supposed to belong to it, God would be he would be showing very big signs around these groups and these movements for people to come in. Their people would be exercising extraordinary charisms. They would be, like we said, working miracles. They would be exuding the fruits of the Spirit. They would be the most joyful, incredible people you've ever met. They would be changing the world in incredible ways. They would be bringing thousands and thousands into the church and evangelizing. You would see this incredible, visible outpouring of God's presence there. And I would challenge people, do we see this? How many people do you know who don't even know about the existence of a Sedevacantist group or the existence of the SSPX? If that's the church that we're supposed to belong to, wouldn't God be trying to draw a little more attention to it?
Even you can find holy men in the conciliar modernist church that have never heard about the SSPX or something like that,
Yes.
So as a little conclusion here, really operating without mission, without canonical mission, is a great danger. It's a great spiritual danger. And submitting to clergy which has no canonical mission and operates outside of the Catholic Church is also a great danger. I think that is why when this begins to happen, errors, doctrinal errors, intellectual errors begin to appear, and that with the SSPX, with the Sedevacantists is evident, and John Salza and Robert Cisco have done an excellent work in their refutation. With the SSPX is beginning to appear. People are confused, but John Salza, I think, is making a great job there. They have this. They ironically they accuse the Catholic Church of heresy, but they are the ones who are in error. Actually, collegiality, errors in collegiality, errors in supply jurisdiction, errors in canonical mission, errors in the nature of the church, errors in sacramental intention. So when you separate from Rome, even if you separate from Rome because you said Rome is defecting from the faith and you have the true faith, there's no way you will lose. You will defect in faith and morals.
Yes.
Another evident bad objective fruit of the SSPX, which we have mentioned, is the division that is inside the SSPX. Maybe you can talk a little bit more about that, Andrew. What was this case of the first nine who split off Lefebvre? What was this case of Williamson? Because this is an objective bad fruit,
Yes. So the nine broke away originally from Archbishop Lefebvre because of serious doctrinal and liturgical differences. Archbishop Lefebvre was making the decision to accept the 1962 Missal. And this made no sense to many of his priests because of the Easter changes that had been made according to the same principles of liturgical reform that eventually led to the 1969 Missal of Pope Paul VI. So a lot of the same principles of the liturgical movement that they do not like were already beginning to take place in the 1962 Missal. And they even had issues with things such as adding St. Joseph's name to the canon of the Mass, among other things. So they were hostile to the Archbishop picking and choosing which Mass missal he's going to accept and which one he wasn't. They said, it's either you're going to be a traditionalist or not. You need to go all the way. If these are the principles that you are accepting, then you need to be consistent with that. And then they also saw that many of the things that the Archbishop was saying as far as what you could and could not accept from Rome and what you could and could not resist against Rome was also inconsistent with the teaching of the church. They delved into the traditional teaching, into the traditions, and they found that there were contradictions between what Archbishop Lefebvre was saying and his leadership and what they were reading for themselves in the documents. And so, of course, this eventually came to a head for the priests. Notice too that it's almost always, whenever there's a physical separation, it's often very closely attached to the Mass, because the Mass is very closely connected to this idea of mission and communion, right? The word Mass itself comes from missa, right? Meaning to send. The last words of the Mass, ite missa est, go forth, it is sent, right? That's an integral part of our celebration, our worship together as Catholics. Also, we talk about receiving communion, right? So communion and mission are integrally connected to the Mass. So as soon as these priests were being made to accept a Mass that was not part of their conception of Catholicism, there had to be a division. They could not worship together. That's why not being able to worship with another Catholic is a sign of schism. It is a natural schism, de facto. If you cannot worship with other Catholics, then you are schismatic, period. I challenge anyone to come up with an argument that will refute that, because you won't find it. The more you study the church's teaching on schism, the more you realize that there is an intimate connection between whether or not we're able to worship with other Catholics that we're having these serious differences with.
I have one objection from people say no, there can be with this I mean to enter the issue of if there is actual schism in the SSPX. People say no, there cannot be. First of all, because there hasn't been a pronounced, definitive judgment of the church, and second, because a schism implies intrinsically a rejection of the authority or power of the Pope, and the SSPX recognize that the Pope is the Pope and has authority. Even they mention it in their masses, so there cannot be schism in the strict sense of the word. How would you respond to this objection?
Yes. So as I pointed out in my debate, and I made an effort to highlight this, it is not requisite for schism to reject the authority of the Pope explicitly in your words, to say, I don't believe the Pope has the authority to teach, govern, and sanctify. That is not requisite for schism. And you can look at the history of schismatic movements, and many of them do not reject, at least at first, they do not reject the Pope's authority. Even the Orthodox recognize him as the first among equals. They recognize that he has a place of preeminence. They just don't believe that he can actually practically use that preeminence in the governance of their life or of their churches. So it is not necessary for schism to reject the Pope. That has to be clear. Schism is primarily in the realm of action. So if you are separating yourself, if you're refusing submission to the Pope in important areas, such as the faith, or such as governance, or such as worship, if you are refusing to follow the leadership and the directives that are being issued by Rome and are being conformed with by the bishops who are in union with Rome, you are entering into a state of separation, into a state of schism, just by that mere fact. You can say the Pope's name in the Mass, you can hang his picture on the wall, you can pray for him until you're blue in the face, but that will not protect you from the situation that you're living in, which is one of practical reality, de facto schism, separation from the church. So it has to be understood that it is not required to reject the authority of the Pope in order to enter into schism, because schism is a sin against charity. Primarily, it's a sin against our common life with Catholics and our life within the family of God, which includes our Holy Father, the Pope, and being under his leadership. And so that's why schism, although it's usually joined with heresy, because if you think about it, if you are practically living a life of separation from the Pope and you're ignoring every other thing that comes out of his mouth, even if your words are not rejecting his authority, your actions are, which is a heresy in the realm of action, if not heresy in the realm of thought. So I don't know if that does that answer your question.
Yes. And this is a teaching from the doctors. Aquinas, for example, he says that what you just said, that schism is usually accompanied by heresy. I am beginning to see that in the SSPX. What I notice as the biggest error, I don't know if it qualifies theologically strictly as heresy, but at least as error. Their condemnation. They are accusing Mother Church of heresy for the doctrine of collegiality, and that is a traditional doctrine of the Church, first of all. And the other error I see, which they used to separate from the Church, is they are undermining the traditional doctrine of the indefectibility of the Church. That is a huge one, I think.
Yes.
When they say modernist church, this modernist church, this intrinsically bad mass, you're saying that the church has become heretic. When you say modernist church, you're saying that church is modernist. Modernism is a heresy. So you have said that the church is a heretic. So
Yes.
it has defected. That undermines completely the doctrine of indefectibility. The same as with the mass.
You're absolutely right, Ezekiel. And I want to jump in here real quick because this is very, very important. Another thing to take into consideration when it comes to schism is, what are your words and actions displaying about the reality itself? Not so much whether or not there's been any declarations. And although even that argument doesn't really hold water, because you can find the popes identifying it as schism from Paul VI all the way to Francis. You can find official documents where they call it a schism, right? So there have been the pronouncement. It doesn't have to be where they come out like in the young pope and beat their staff on the ground and say, "I declare that there's a schism," right? That is not necessary for there to be a schism. People seem to think that there is, but it isn't. All right. So when it comes to the schism, what do their actions and their words display about it? And one of the first things you can find with people who are separating from the church is this distinction between a true church and a false church, a distinction between a spiritual church and a physical church, a distinction between eternal Rome and temporal Rome.
That is a
And that
heresy.
was when it first began to go south, was when Archbishop Lefebvre identified this distinction. He made this distinction, which has been made by the Protestants and made by many, and it goes completely against the teaching of the church, especially as you can find it in Pope Pius XII, Mystici Corporis Christi, where even in the encyclical where he's emphasizing the mystical body of Christ, he makes the point to say you cannot separate the temporal and material aspect and institutional aspect of the church from the spiritual aspect of the church. That is heresy. And the fact that they're making distinctions between themselves as the true church and a false conciliar church shows that there is not a true unity. And this idea that there's still one church and they're still part of the Catholic Church, that's a facade. It's a complete facade.
Absolutely. I think I am, rethinking. I think that's the main error which they use to justify the schism among with the new mass and the alleged heresies in Vatican II. Another thing people say no is there is no declaration of schism, and if you look at Ecclesia Dei statements, they are consistently saying be careful with the SSPX not to imbibe a schismatic mentality. They say that almost in every response. They don't recommend their masses. They even more. Saint John Paul II, in his motu proprio Ecclesia Dei Afflicta, he said, "This is a schismatic act," and then he said, "I warn the faithful that a formal adherence to schism implies excommunication late sententia." Why would he said that if there was no schism?
Exactly. That's exactly right. No, but that always gets conveniently ignored. And you have to realize that the laity have a responsibility. We don't just get to, go and pick and choose and do whatever we want with impunity. We have a responsibility as well. The reason the SSPX is able to continue its life of the church is because of rich lay donors, because of all of the people who are continuing to support their ministry. There is a schism because of us, the laity. If we all withdrew from them, they would be unable to exercise their illegitimate ministry anymore.
Yes, another thing about schism, if you take the definition from Aquinas, and you take the definition from the Code of Canon Law, and you take the definition of the Catechism of Saint John Paul II, it's the same definition, rejection to submission to the Supreme Pontiff and rejection to communion with the members
Catholic
of the Church submitted
right.
to. That applies perfectly to the SSPX.
On both counts, yes. Both the vertical and the horizontal.
Yeah. That's right. All right, let's see some of the questions here. Let me see. They're chatting a lot, they have been having great fun here. So let's see. Let's see. What do you say to those who claim the council was maliciously ambiguous?
Well, I would say that I love it when that one gets brought up. It actually kind of cracks me up. I realize the reason for it is because there were people at the council, definitely not the most orthodox, who were very influential, who said, we're trying to phrase these sentences in such a way that because we know how we'll interpret them afterwards, because we've got a plan for these, right?
The time
bomb. This is a time bomb in there. And if we were to reject every council or every church document that some malicious clergymen had an agenda and they were able to put something in there that they thought was ambiguous that they could mess with afterwards, then you might as well throw the whole corpus of everything out, because God works within his church, which has the wheat and the chaff, right? You will find heretics at just about every council, right? You had Arians at the Council of Nicaea, right? And they were lobbying for their what they wanted as well. That's what the church comes together and they hash these things out. But there's a difference between that process that takes place and then the completed document. Once the completed document is taken by the Pope and then promulgated with all the bishops, then that document becomes a part of the corpus of the church's teaching. So even if somebody put an ambiguous statement in there, that ambiguity has to be interpreted in line with the church's tradition. That was the point of Pope Benedict XVI. Just like every other ambiguous statement that you find in sacred scripture, that you find in the church's tradition, that you find in the Second Vatican Council, you take that ambiguity and you interpret it in line with the common teaching and the common faith of the church. Ambiguity does not mean that a document is wrong, even if there were evil men who wanted to abuse it. It's like saying, let's throw out the Bible because Protestant reformers have been interpreting its ambiguities and starting all these terrible movements. The ambiguity argument is just so bogus.
Yeah, same thing applies to Bugnini and the New Mass. For those who have questions about the Second Vatican II, there's a lot of good stuff in YouTube, especially Michael Lofton. I recommend that. And I will be doing some videos addressing those points, especially ecumenism, collegiality, and religious liberty, which are the three main doctrines which the SSPX reject in toto, saying expressly that collegiality is a heresy. The Holy Mother Church is teaching heresy for more than 60 years. I can believe. Okay, let's see the following question. Do you and Andrew think this mentality affects other traditional groups like FSSP? This is a good one. If so, how much? I still have seen this air of superiority in other trad groups. So, Andrew?
Yes. So I think so. One thing, Dom and I are going to be discussing this a little bit later over at the Logos project, because we have to remember that the FSSP and the Indult and a lot of them are recovering extreme traditionalists. So they came out of this movement that lost its trajectory. It started moving in the direction moved by the charismatic leadership of Archbishop Lefebvre down this dark rabbit hole, right? Down this this trajectory of separation with Rome. And the priests of the FSSP and others are very influenced by a lot of this. And so it's important to realize that, and this is, you have to take it on a case-by-case basis, because I've met priests, FSSP priests, who are rock solid, accept the Second Vatican Council, accept the Novus Ordo Missae, are fully in life with and connected to the life of the church. And they themselves are recognizing that there are these issues in the traditional movement. Those priests are amazing, right? And same thing goes for Institute of Christ the King, right? There are priests who have fully made the switch into the heart and bosom of a Holy Mother Church. But then there are also priests, and this isn't just priests in the FSSP or these other groups. This is all there. There are also a lot of other, even diocesan priests who fall into this camp. They are imbibing these errors that this false, that the traditionalist movement, which is moving in this awful direction away from the church and actually even attacking the church. They are actually accepting a lot of that. And because of that, many of them are becoming a destructive influence in the church. So, I mean, I think the actions and words of these people and who they are speaks for themselves, but you do have to be careful of it. It was within this movement that, because often this movement, especially people who are in tune with a lot of um, these talking points or the Lefebvre narrative, um, they're in these FSSP and traditional Catholic circles, and that can often lead you into something like the SSPX or state of occultism. That's what happened with my family. Um, here's one interaction that happened that moved my family out of the attending FSSP masses and into the arms of the SSPX. And they were having coffee and donuts downstairs after an FSSP mass. And my mom asked one of the parishioners, "Well, what would you guys do if Rome took away your right to say the traditional Latin mass?" And this parishioner said, "Oh, they would never do that because they know we'd go right back to the Society of St. Pius X." And it was that interaction and that conversation that led my parents to say, "Well, if that's where the fight really is, and you would just go back if they took this away from you, what are we doing here?" That means that Archbishop Lefebvre is the true hero. So you do have to be careful. And I truly hope that we can recover the positive aspects of the traditional Catholic movement and reorient it into the heart of the church. But right now, it's on a dangerous trajectory.
Yes, I would. Let me 1 second here. Yes, I would add to that. This is a spiritual combat, so no one is, saved from the, this is a demonic attack. Demons of pride, demons of schism, of division. So um, I think the traditionalists are most exposed to this kind of demonic attack and this kind of spirits of division and schism. So yeah, I would not be surprised if I found some FSSP or Ecclesia Day with this similar Lefebvrean mentality. So, what is the best way to show people that the history and real tradition of the church is what we need to follow and not personal interpretations and private revelations?
Yes. I'd say be faithful. I mean, be faithful to the church, be open to trust the church, trust that the Holy Spirit is still guiding the Pope and all the bishops in union with him to direct the church through the stormy waters of the sea. Uh, we have to be careful to not buy into every thing that is said about Pope Francis, especially spun by the secular media, because so often what he does and what he says are really completely shown in a very poor light. We have to try to show people that there are narratives that you can fall into and that they can actually hold you prisoner like a straitjacket. And that's one of the reasons why I don't call myself a traditional Catholic, because for starters, it drives me crazy just from an etymological standpoint, because it's like saying wet water. To be a Catholic, to be a faithful Catholic is to be immersed in tradition. So we shouldn't feel the need to distinguish ourselves from other Catholics. We should just be faithful Catholics and say, yes, I am a faithful Catholic. I am a Roman Catholic. You don't have to add this qualifier to distinguish yourself from heretical Catholics or others, because their actions speak for themselves. So hold fast to who we are and to our identity as Catholics. Live it with joy, live it with peace and serenity, and that will speak volumes to others. If we do our part in the church to build up our local communities, enhance the reverence of our liturgies, support our local pastors, improve the teaching at RCIA, things like that, we can actually build the church in a real concrete way that getting onto the blogosphere and tearing down the church, of course, and criticizing. Never will. So let's make a positive impact and grow the church from the ground up.
I think that there's many ways, faith in the true church, faith in the promises of Christ. Maybe studying what the indefectibility of the church means. If only we understood better what that means, we would not even be questioning the council and the new mass and doing apologetics. I think that the Logos Project is doing a great work. Please, the audience who is hearing this, stay tuned. John Salsa is coming, and that will be Fire on Earth. So stay tuned. Here you have my boy Bartel is making the rounds. I will be following his career with great interest. I will as well.
Thanks, Sean. Yeah, I'm trying not to add to the noise. I hope that my career, as you said, or my whatever role I have to play in the church, I hope it's one that is positive and builds up the church and doesn't just add to the noise and confuse people. So please continue to pray for me and that I continue to do that.
Awesome. Let's see. Sorry. There's so many questions here. I think Dom is doing the work. Dom is doing the work in the chat. Here there is a question. Maybe this. I don't know what the word nodding is. It says, I feel like you guys are just nodding for everything, which is not wrong if the lead is good, but many things the Pope or bishops do make me doubt if we should continue nodding. What nodding is? What is nodding?
Oh, nodding is when you're shaking your head up and down in agreement. Like, yes.
So we are papolatry.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. So what I think Agent Bricks is saying is, we don't want to necessarily be yes men, right? And there's a big difference between, being a yes man and being somebody who's always a no man, right? And I think the point here is to let's not be the resistors and the protesters who are always the no men, right? You don't have to be, a yes man and say that every single thing that the Pope does is prudent or correct. But let's bring it a little bit closer to being a yes man, because that's actually closer to being a good Catholic. Is being closer. It's like virtue. Virtue is not perfectly in the center of the spectrum. You have two vices. You have a vice and you have two vices, opposing vices, and virtue in the center, but it's not perfectly in the center. Usually it's closer to one side than the other. And in this case of being faithful Catholics, it is closer to being a yes man and assenting to the authority of the church than being a no man. So my appeal is to let's bring it closer to being a yes man, not in a extreme or unbalanced way, but let's stop just being no men for like every single thing.
Yeah, God is not gonna judge you because you have too much faith in His church. So, and this some final point here. Your article, you mentioned the experiment of tradition. Is that right? Of Lefebvre?
The experiment of tradition. Yes.
Yeah. That has failed, right? It's evident.
Yes. As he expressed it and as he set it up through his leadership in his life and his legacy. So it's referring to a quote of his that says, we'll show Rome. We'll let them allow us our experiment of tradition, and we will show them that we will be successful. And that was certainly not my experience It was definitely not the experience of many people I've been encountering who are reaching out to me. That the more you go down the trajectory of the traditionalist movement as set by the example of Archbishop Lefebvre, it is ultimately destructive. So if we're going to salvage the traditional Catholic movement as it was originally started in the positive way by those priests grouping around Lefebvre and wanting to, be faithful priests, devoted to the church, to traditional piety, to authentic worship and things such as that, really emphasizing these important traditional aspects of our faith. We have to do that in a way that is positive, that is uplifting, and is faithful to the Pope and the Church. The more that we fall into this infighting and this negativity and this separation and us versus them, the more it's going to tear us apart from each other. And that is not of God. Love, as St. Francis de Sales teaches in the treatise on the love of God, love brings unity. And if there isn't unity, then you know that there is going to be the opposite of love. You're going to have hatred and bitterness. And the fruit of that is separation.
Absolutely. I would add, maybe one could argue, well, Andrew, that's your experience. That's your subjective experience. I would say no, folks. There are a lot of errors, objective errors in the SSPX mentality, in Archbishop Lefebvre himself. Intellectual errors, doctrinal errors. We have what we talk about, the objective divisions occurred within the SSPX. We know who the father of division is. We know who the father of error is. We have the fruits of the Holy Spirit: bitterness, anger, negativity.
Fear is a very dominant one as well. Yes.
Lack of faith, criticism. That's not from God either.
Yeah.
So,
well, when it comes to subjective and objective, again, we have to take them both. The reason why I've been trying to share my story is because there is a connection between my subjective experience and the objective problems, the objective errors, the objective actions of the Society of St. Pius X and Sedevacantist groups. There is a connection that flows from those objective facts into my subjective experience. And that's one of the things I strove to do in my open letter, was to show that there's a connection to these objective problems within the movement and my own fallout within my family. So when you take the two together, objective and subjective, you're able to see a bit more of the full picture.
Totally. So I will put that link of the article. It's really good. It's a rhetorical article, but very apologetic. It's great. So, well, I think enough for today, folk.
Sounds good. Well, thanks for having me on, Ezekiel.
Oh, thank you, Andrew. Thank you, and stay tuned. Stay tuned. Michael Lofton is coming. John Salsa is hopefully coming as well. And stay tuned with the Logos Project. There you will have Andrew, Dom, and John Salsa making a lot of shows, distinguishing the errors, the actual objective errors of the SSPX and Archbishop Lefebvre himself. So, thanks for listening. Stay tuned. God bless. Thanks, Andrew.